I have a metal plate in my forehead. I had frontal lobe issues because I was hitting the hammer. My skull kind of breaks right here. My jaw pretty much
For 34
shattered.
years, the man who wiped out most of a family in their own home was nowhere to be found entirely, while 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett grew up as the only person who survived that night. And when DNA finally caught him in 2018, it looked like the clean ending everyone had waited 3 decades for. Except it wasn't, because the same DNA testimony that put him away for life is now tangled up in one of the biggest forensic scandals in Colorado history, and that story isn't finished yet.
Today, a big shift in the trial for the man accused in the 1984 Hammer murders. The prosecution rested yesterday.
Right before all of this, the Bennett family's life looked almost aggressively normal. They just moved into a new house in Aurora, Colorado, around Thanksgiving of 1983. The neighborhood was still half-built, a cul-de-sac full of empty lots and unfinished frames, quiet enough at night that you could count the porch lights. Bruce Bennett was 27. His wife, Deborah, was 26. They had 2 little girls, Melissa, 7, just a couple of days from turning 8, and Vanessa, only 3. You picture a family like that settling into a brand new house in a brand new neighborhood, and it's not hard to imagine what that felt like. New paint smell, boxes still stacked somewhere, a birthday coming up that Melissa had probably already started counting down. That night, the garage door was open. The way a garage door is open in a neighborhood that seems secure, because you're new, because the block is still mostly empty lots, or because nothing bad has ever happened here that you know of. A small, normal choice. 100 families make on regular nights, and nothing comes of it. There isn't a lot on the public record about who Bruce and Deborah Bennett were day to day, what they did for work, how they lived their lives. What is on the record is what came after. Decades later, Bruce's mother, Connie Bennett, stood up in a courtroom and described her family as strong, as people who kept living productive lives no matter what had been taken from them. And Vanessa, the 3-year-old in that house, would grow up to become the only person who could ever say what that night was actually like. 6 days before anything happened to the Bennetts, something happened about 15 miles away, in Lakewood. On January 10th, 1984, a 50-year-old woman named Patricia Smith was in her own home, eating lunch, when someone got in. She was beaten to death with a hammer. Sexually assaulted. Whoever did it left the hammer behind in her condo and walked out. No name, no suspect, nothing to go on beyond the method itself. And at the time, nobody connected it to anything. It was just a horrifying, isolated crime in a quiet Denver suburb. Nobody in Aurora had any reason to think about that case. Why would they? Different neighborhood, different family, nothing linking the two beyond a hammer nobody outside the investigation even knew about yet. So the 6 days in between just passed. Normal days. No threats, no strange cars on the block, no sense that anything was wrong. There's no moment here where you can point and say, that's where it could have been stopped. The Bennetts were just living their lives in a half-built neighborhood, 2 days out from a birthday, with no idea that a week earlier, 15 miles away, someone had already shown exactly what he was capable of. He wasn't caught after Lakewood, and he wasn't caught after what came next either. Later that same year, he'd do something just as violent in a completely different state, and even that wouldn't be enough to catch him. It just didn't look like a pattern yet, because nobody alive knew there was one. 6 days after Patricia Smith died, it was the Bennett's turn. Sometime during the night of January 15th, someone walked through that open garage door. There's no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. No broken glass, no busted lock, nothing. Whoever it was just walked in. At some point, Bruce Bennett confronted him. Investigators believe it happened at the top of the stairs. A struggle broke out, violent enough that the two of them went down the staircase together, breaking several of the spindles on the way. Bruce didn't win that fight. He was beaten with a hammer and his throat was cut with a knife from the kitchen. Deborah was attacked too. So were both girls. Melissa, 7 years old, 2 days from her birthday, was sexually assaulted and killed. Vanessa, 3, was beaten badly enough that no one expected her to survive the night. She did. Whoever did this didn't take anything of value. Didn't ransack the place looking for cash or jewelry. He came in, did what he came to do, and left the same way he arrived, through a garage door nobody had bothered to close, in a neighborhood where nobody had any reason to think they needed to. By morning, 3 members of a family were dead, and a 3-year-old girl was the only one left who'd ever be able to explain any of it, except she couldn't. Not at 3, not for a long, long time. An open garage door, no forced entry, no missing property, no idea who'd done it. He'd left one thing behind, though: DNA. Except in January of 1984, that word barely meant anything to a police department. Nobody testing evidence that year had any way to turn a biological sample into a face, let alone a suspect. He was already gone, clean. Whoever this man was, Aurora wasn't the last house he'd walk into that year. 7 months later, in a different state entirely, he'd do it again to a couple asleep in their own bedroom. And even then, with police right on top of him, it still wouldn't be enough to connect him to what happened here. It would take another 34 years, and a piece of technology that didn't even exist yet, to put a name to him. Connie Bennett tried calling her son's house the morning of January 16th. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. That's not automatically alarming on its own. People miss calls, people sleep in, phones ring into an empty kitchen for all kinds of reasons. But something about it didn't sit right with her, enough that she went over to check. She found them. There's no clean way to describe what that moment must have been like for her, and the reporting on it doesn't try to. What's on the record is simpler and somehow worse. She walked into her son's house expecting an ordinary Monday, and instead she found her son, her daughter-in-law, and her granddaughter dead, and her other granddaughter, 3 years old, badly injured but alive. She called for help. First responders arrived to a scene that told them almost nothing about who'd done this. No forced entry, no obvious motive, no property missing. Just a family, and a garage door left open the night before. Forensic science existed in 1984, but it was nowhere close to what it is now. Investigators could collect biological evidence at a scene, and they did, at this one, but the technology of the time could only sort that evidence into broad blood types. It couldn't build a genetic profile. It couldn't point to a person. It could really only confirm that whoever left it behind wasn't one of the 4 people already lying in that house. So the evidence got bagged, tagged, and put into storage. Not because anyone was careless with it, because there was simply nothing more the science of the time could do with it yet. It would sit there for years, waiting on technology that didn't exist. Investigators did notice something, though. 6 days earlier, in Lakewood, a woman named Patricia Smith had been killed the same way. Beaten with a hammer in her own home, no forced entry. 2 attacks, 15 miles apart, less than a week apart. Both involving a hammer and both involving a home that hadn't been broken into. Nobody could confirm the 2 cases were connected. Nobody could disprove it either. It's the kind of thing that sits in the back of an investigator's mind for years without ever quite turning into a fact. A pattern that looks obvious in hindsight, but isn't provable in the moment, because obvious isn't evidence. Without a name, without a face, and without the technology to get either one, the case did what cold cases do. It slowed. Then it stalled. Detectives kept the file open. This wasn't a case anyone in Aurora PD forgot about. But open and moving aren't the same thing. And for a long stretch, this one just wasn't moving. Somewhere out there, the person responsible was still walking around. Whether he even remembered what he'd done to that family, whether it registered to him as anything at all, nobody investigating in 1984 had any way of knowing. All they had was a sealed evidence box, a theory nobody could prove, and a 3-year-old girl who was going to have to grow up without ever getting to ask her parents a single question about any of it. For a long time, this case belonged to one detective more than anyone else. Stephen Connor, with Aurora PD's cold case unit, picked it up years into the silence and just kept it moving, in whatever small ways he could. Reviewing the file again, re-interviewing people who'd give him 10 more minutes, waiting on forensic science to catch up to a case that had outrun it decades earlier. At some point, that waiting started to pay off, just not in the way anyone expected yet. Investigators used the DNA collected back in 1984 to build something new, a forensic composite, a predicted face generated from the biological profile itself, showing what the suspect probably looked like at the time of the murders and what he'd likely look like now. They put it out publicly. 40, 50 calls came in off that composite alone. Most of them went nowhere. Tips that led to people who weren't him, DNA samples that got collected and compared and quietly ruled out one by one. Connor had a phrase for what that felt like. He said it was like chasing a ghost. Here's the thing about a case like this, though. The killer wasn't some phantom who vanished without a trace after Aurora. He wasn't even careful. 7 months after the Bennett murders, in August of 1984, he was in Kingman, Arizona, in custody on an unrelated attempted murder charge, being transported by 2 deputies for a court hearing. During a stop at a gas station in Henderson, Nevada, he escaped, ran, changed clothes inside a Kmart so he wouldn't be recognized, and then, that same night, he broke into a home in Henderson and attacked a couple in their bedroom with an axe handle while their 2 young sons slept in other rooms of the house. He was caught 2 days later. Park rangers picked him up at Lake Mead, and that's when the name attached to all of this finally enters the story. Alex Christopher Ewing, 23 years old at the time. Nevada convicted him of attempted murder and related charges for the Henderson attack and sentenced him to a term that would run through 2037. So, and this is the part that's genuinely hard to square, the man responsible for what happened to the Bennett family had been sitting in a Nevada prison cell since the summer of 1984. Not hiding, not on the run, just incarcerated under his own name for a different, almost identical kind of violence. What kept him invisible to Colorado investigators for over 3 decades wasn't that he was clever, or careful, or lucky. It was a Nevada state law. For years, Nevada restricted when and how the state could collect DNA from someone in custody, and Ewing simply didn't fall into a category where that applied. Not for attempted murder, not for burglary, not for any of what he'd been convicted of there. His DNA existed. His body was, quite literally, sitting in a cell the whole time. Colorado just had no legal way to reach it. That changed in 2018. Nevada updated the law, and it opened the door to collecting DNA from inmates who'd been off limits before. Ewing's sample went in. It got run through a national law enforcement database, and it matched to the DNA from the Bennett scene and to the DNA from Patricia Smith's murder 6 days before it. 34 years. That's the number everyone in this story keeps coming back to, and it's not an exaggeration for effect. It's just what it took. Aurora Police Chief Nick Metz stood in front of cameras when the match came through and said hearing the DNA results sent a jolt through my spine. Detectives flew out to Nevada to interview Ewing directly and collect a second DNA sample, just to be certain the first result wasn't a fluke. According to court documents, when they showed him a crime scene photo of Patricia Smith, he reacted physically, visibly, unmistakably. He also told them he'd lived in the Denver area in 1984, working construction and plumbing jobs. By 2021, Ewing was standing trial in Arapahoe County for the murders of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett, and the case the prosecution built rested almost entirely on forensic science that hadn't existed the night those 3 people died. District Attorney John Kellner told the jury that Ewing's own DNA placed him inside that house, specifically from sperm recovered on the carpet underneath Melissa Bennett's body. That was the anchor of the state's case. Not a confession, not an eyewitness. A DNA profile connecting a 1984 crime scene to a man sitting in a Nevada prison 37 years later. The person who had to make that science make sense to 12 jurors was a Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic scientist named Yvonne "Missy" Woods. She was on the stand for more than 3 hours, walking through the analysis that tied Ewing's DNA to the scene. By this point in her career, Woods had spent decades as one of the state's go-to DNA experts, the kind of analyst prosecutors called in on the cases that mattered most. After the state's case wrapped, following Woods's testimony, the defense moved for a mistrial. The judge denied it. The jury believed the DNA evidence enough to convict Ewing on every count. Nobody in that courtroom, not the jury, not Kellner, not the family finally hearing a verdict after 37 years, had any reason yet to think twice about the analyst whose testimony had just helped put him away. That's still years off. For now, all anyone knew was that the case was closed. and the man responsible had a name. The verdict felt like the end of the story. 37 years of nothing, closed out by a DNA match nobody could argue with. Except a few years after that trial, the same analyst who spent 3 hours explaining that DNA to the jury started showing up in a very different kind of headline. And once you hear what she was actually accused of, it's hard not to wonder how many other verdicts just like this one are sitting on the same foundation. For the family, the break wasn't the trial. It was that phone call in 2018, the one telling them a name finally existed. By then, Connie Bennett had spent 34 years as the woman who found her son's family that morning. Vanessa Bennett had spent 34 years as the toddler who survived, without ever really getting to be just a person who survived something, always. In some sense, the case's only living witness, even though she'd been 3 years old and had nothing she could tell anyone. And somewhere in Nevada, the man responsible had been sitting in a cell that entire time, unaware, or maybe not caring, that a national DNA database was about to catch up to him. When Chief Metz stood at that podium and talked about a jolt going through his spine, he wasn't speaking for himself alone. Randy McCoy standing behind him, representing the family. That was 34 years of an unanswered question, finally getting an answer. But a name isn't a conviction. Between that 2018 match and the 2021 verdict sat 3 more years of building an actual case, confirming the DNA a second time, interviewing Ewing directly, and constructing a prosecution around forensic evidence collected under 1984 conditions and tested using science that had evolved dramatically in the decades since. What came after, the trial, the sentence, and everything currently still unresolved about the evidence that got him there, is its own story. The trial ran from late July into early August of 2021 in Arapahoe County. On August 6th, the jury came back guilty on every count. Sentencing came 11 days later. Judge Darren Vall handed down the maximum available under the law as it existed in 1984.
The court sentences you to life in the Department of Corrections.
Life in prison, with parole possible after 20 years, for each of the 3 people Ewing had killed. Then he ordered the sentences to run consecutively, one after another, not at the same time. Practically speaking, that guaranteed something simpler than the legal language makes it sound. Ewing would die in prison. At sentencing, the judge told him he hoped that fact would bring the family some measure of comfort after waiting almost 40 years. Connie Bennett told the court she wouldn't call Ewing an animal because animals have a purpose in the world, and she didn't think he'd shown he had one.
I'd like to direct my statement to the court and not to the murderer. Some people may call him an animal, but I won't, because I think animals have a purpose in this world.
Connie Bennett.
She said her family was strong, that they'd built productive lives despite what he took from them, but she didn't pretend the loss was resolved. She called it a wound that would never heal. Vanessa Bennett, 3 years old the night her family was destroyed, 41 by the time she stood in that courtroom, gave her own statement too. She'd spent nearly her entire life as the answer to a question nobody could ask her directly. What happened in that house? Now, finally, she got to speak in a courtroom where everyone already knew the answer.
I didn't just lose my parents and sister. I lost trust in people. I lost my dignity and my pride. I lost the person who I was supposed to be.
3 consecutive life sentences. That was Arapahoe County's case closed. But Ewing wasn't finished facing consequences, and the Bennett case wasn't the only one connected to him. He still had to answer for Patricia Smith, the woman killed 6 days before the Bennetts, in Lakewood, the case that first tipped investigators toward a connection back in 1984. The first attempt to try him for her murder in October of 2021 ended almost as soon as it began, a mistrial, after his defense requested a competency evaluation. It took a second trial, in April of 2022, for a jury to convict him of Smith's murder too, after roughly 4 hours of deliberation. That sentence was ordered to run consecutively to the 3 he was already serving for the Bennetts. 4 life sentences, 2 crime scenes, 1 hammer, 1 man, and 37 years between the murders and the verdicts. By any conventional measure, this is where a case like this ends. Convicted, sentenced. No appeal that changes the outcome for the family. Ewing isn't walking out of prison, regardless of what happens next. Except something else happened after the verdicts came in, something that has nothing to do with Ewing's guilt or innocence and everything to do with the woman who helped convict him. Missy Woods, the analyst who spent 3 hours on the stand walking that Arapahoe County jury through the DNA evidence, left the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in November of 2023, right around the time an internal review turned up serious problems with her work. Investigators eventually found that Woods had cut corners and manipulated data across her nearly 30-year career in more than 1,000 cases she'd touched. One of those cases, specifically documented, was her 2009 testing of the evidence from Patricia Smith's murder, where investigators found she'd deleted data and left required work incomplete. Whether her handling of the Bennett family's evidence specifically was affected the same way isn't something the public record has confirmed one way or the other. What is confirmed is that Ewing is appealing one of his convictions, and his attorney has pointed directly at Woods' misconduct as grounds for it. In June of 2026, Woods pleaded guilty to 4 felony charges: cybercrime, perjury, attempting to influence a public servant, and forgery, out of an original 102 counts. She's due to be sentenced in September of 2026, facing somewhere between 8 and 16 years. That sentencing hasn't happened yet. Neither has a ruling on Ewing's appeal. So, how did he hide in plain sight for 34 years? Not through some criminal mastermind move. He was in a cell the entire time, under his own name, for an attack disturbingly similar to the one that killed the Bennetts. What kept him hidden was a line in Nevada law about when the state could collect DNA from someone already in custody. Change that line, and the whole case moves. Not cunning, paperwork. And the DNA that finally closed that gap, the evidence that let Vanessa Bennett stand in a courtroom at 41 and finally say something out loud about that night, came from an analyst who's now a convicted felon herself, for exactly the kind of misconduct that makes juries trust DNA evidence in the first place. This case doesn't live or die on her word alone. Ewing's own actions, before and after, do plenty of that work. But the piece the prosecution leaned on hardest passed through her hands, on this exact investigation. Ewing's appeal is still pending. Woods is still waiting on her own sentencing, in September of 2026. Neither is likely to put him back on the street, but a case everyone treated as permanently closed in 2021 is, in a narrower way, still open. 34 years for the truth to catch up to a man who never really hid at all. Now, a different question: whether the system that caught him held up its end as cleanly as it looked like it did. If you like this coverage, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep creating content we're passionate about sharing with you. Remember to look after yourself and stay safe out there.